Thank you, Senator Hinch. Senator Back.
Thank you, Acting Deputy President. In April of this year, on a self-funded tour, I happened to have the occasion to visit Cuba. And amongst meetings I had with the Vice President, the Minister associated with Mines and Energy and also Foreign Affairs, I had the privilege of meeting with the Director of the Centre for Genetic Engineering and Biotechnology, Dr. Manuel Castaneda. And this evening I wish to present some of the information that Dr. Castaneda gave me, not in relation to Cuba so much, Madam Acting Deputy President, but indeed to Australia. And I want to speak briefly about non-melanoma skin cancers, but particularly I want to speak about the work being undertaken in Cuba on the whole issue associated with diabetes and foot ulcers, and particularly the terrible sequels that do occur from there. To give you some understanding, Cuba, of course, has been isolated for many, many years, and not the least from the United States of America, but their whole focus has actually been on health care within their communities, including in their rural communities. To give you some stats of just how interesting and how successful they've been, in 1960 there were 37 infant deaths per 1,000 births and a life expectancy in that country of 62 years. By 2014, the 37 deaths per 1,000 had reduced to 4, and the life expectancy had increased from 62 to 79 years, with a very, very heavy emphasis on public health, including in rural areas. They've had enormous successes out of that institute, with some 30,000 personnel working in 31 collaborating enterprises on that campus just outside Havana. They've been working, for example, on a nasal vaccine against hepatitis B, a disease which is now practically eliminated in Cuba. Prostate cancer, a vaccine for which they have international patent, 2,200 cases in 1992, down to 16 in 2012. This resonates for us. Also, too, I mentioned issues associated with non-melanoma skin cancers, and I'll come back to that in a moment. What was humbling for me, Madam Acting Deputy President, was that Dr. Castaneda delivered to me statistics about the instance of these conditions in Australia, state by state, major city by major city. And I checked, of course, with our Assistant Minister for Health to find out whether those figures were accurate, and indeed they were. He presented to me, for example, the most common causes of death in Australia and the 16 most lethal cancers here in our country, not in Cuba, but here in Australia. He presented to me data that they are undertaking work in Cuba associated with non-melanoma skin cancers, and of course Australia is the world leader in skin cancers generally. And the statistics he showed me was that in Australia currently we have about 500,000, about 577,000 cases a year of non-melanoma skin cancer in our country. And they are achieving enormous success with non-surgical intervention using pharmaceuticals for which they have international patents. Indeed, the Institute's got 1,816 international patents approved and another 2,336 pending. But, Madam Acting Deputy President, I want to go to the whole question associated with amputations as a result of foot ulcers caused by diabetes, not in Cuba but in our country. And these are the figures that Dr. David Gillespie and the other place confirmed when I got off a plane from the United States the other day. We have 4,400 amputations a year in our country as a result of diabetes, 12 a day, 7 days a week. There are 10,000 hospital admissions for diabetes-related foot ulcers, and a third of those who are diagnosed end up in hospital, and a third of those who end up in hospital end up with a limb being amputated. That is the level of this issue. What does it cost us? It costs the Australian economy, apart from the emotional cost to the 4,400 families every year, the 12 families every day, it costs us around about $3.5 billion annually. The average person spends 24 days in hospital. We have 1.4 million Australians are affected by this particular scourge, and as I said earlier, a third of those 1.4 million will end up with ulcers and end up in hospital, and a third of them will have amputations. And as he presented to me the statistics and the photograph, indeed, of a Victorian truck driver, Mr Alan Tiltson, was forced to retire from his job as a truck driver in Melbourne because of ongoing foot complications caused by the fact that he had an amputation. When I came out of Cuba and went back to Panama and spoke to our ambassador, and I don't think he'll mind me saying so, I rang him to tell him and give him an overview of my trip to Cuba, and he said to me, "Chris, this is personal to me." He said, "My father lost a limb to amputation from diabetes, a foot ulcer." He said he then lost the other limb and he lost his life, and my abiding memory as a kid was of my mother carrying my legless father around, who had lost both limbs as a result of this scourge. What is interesting, Madam Acting Deputy President, is that in Cuba they have started a non-surgical treatment using an injection around the abscess. And for those of you who haven't yet had your dinner, I won't go into the pathology of it, but there is a treatment every 2nd day for 18 days around the abscess causing the foot ulcer, and the Cubans are enjoying a 95% success rate with non-surgical intervention with this particular treatment. 95% success rate. So what Dr Castaneda did for me was to go back and say, well, here are your statistics on a state-by-state and on a city-by-city approach in your country. His estimate is that we could reduce that level of 4,400 amputations down to far less than 1,000 a year, with the emotional saving to those families and the incredible financial saving to our health system. But what's interesting in that country is, because of their public health circumstance and a hierarchy right down into the rural and regional areas of Cuba, at the very earliest stages now, when somebody sees that they have a blister which may become an ulcer, rather than sit back and do nothing, they immediately go to a local health service. That service may or may not be able to provide the treatment, but they can immediately move it up the hierarchical tree so that they can start that treatment process. It was humbling, Madam Acting Deputy President, to learn the United States, having embargoed most activities in Cuba, have very graciously lifted the embargo on surgical, non-surgical and pharmaceutical treatments. He also told me that they had reached out to many countries to have an international symposium in 2015 or 16, to which we were invited, but unfortunately we were unable, or we did not attend. The incidence of diabetes, of course, Madam Acting Deputy President, is going up dramatically in most countries of the world, and we are no exception. It's a factor of our modern lifestyle. Cubans, of course, are very, very focused on this because sugar is a major part of their economy and has been a major part of their diet. The head of Diabetes Australia says that there's been 100,000 Australians diagnosed with diabetes in the last year alone. And yet, at this moment, we have no formal reporting system in place, and yet hospitals are reporting increases in amputations. And lest you think it is only a condition of older people, we know very well that the different forms of diabetes attack people at different ages, including from the very youngest. I make these comments this evening. I've engaged with the Health Minister, with the Aboriginal Affairs Minister, with the International Relations Minister, with my friend Ken Wyatt, who has responsibility for Indigenous health, and of course Judy Moylan, who, as you and I both know, was the member for Pearce, is the chair of Diabetes Australia. It's something that I want to see continued in my time beyond the Senate, Madam Acting Deputy President, because here is a country reaching out to us, offering their service, offering their expertise. In my view, it is for us to pick up the phone, to thank them, to accept the invitation to come to Australia to talk about the work they're doing in those particular disease treatments. Thank you.